I found a woman who had been dead for 15 years, crouched barefoot in a moss-covered rock shelter in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, pressing a wet cloth against the infected leg of a creature that was 7 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown fur. She looked up at me with sun-darkened skin and gray-streaked hair hanging past her waist, and she did not ask to be rescued, did not cry, did not say my name for almost a full minute. She put a finger to her lips and whispered, "Quiet, he is finally letting me help." The woman was Lisa Moore. She had been a 4th-grade teacher at my school. The last time I saw her, she was wearing a Columbia fleece pullover and Morel hiking boots and supervising 23 children on a field trip. That was in May of 1988. The day I found her in that rock shelter was in July of 2003. In the 15 years between those two moments, search teams had combed the mountains. Tracking dogs had refused to enter the forest. Her father had hiked himself into a fatal heart attack looking for her, and every official report had concluded she was dead. She was not dead. She was nursing a Bigfoot. And what I am about to tell you is the story of how that happened, and why I helped her, and why I kept her secret for over 2 decades until tonight. My name is Paul Wright. I am 82 years old. In 1988, I was the assistant principal at Ridgeview Elementary in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a small lakeside town in the northern panhandle where everybody knew everybody, and the mountains started about 15 minutes from the school parking lot. I had been in the job for 2 years, long enough to understand the politics and short enough to still care about the kids. I drove a 1985 Ford Bronco that burned oil and had a cassette deck that only worked when the temperature was above 40 degrees. I lived in a 2-bedroom house on Mullen Avenue that I had bought for $53,000 the year before, which gives you some idea of what Coeur d'Alene was like before the real estate boom turned it into something unrecognizable. I am telling you these details because I want you to understand the world I was living in before it split open. It was an ordinary world. I was an ordinary man. What happened next was not ordinary, and I need you to feel the distance between the before and the after. Lisa Moore was the best teacher at Ridgeview, and I say that having supervised every teacher in the building. She was 31 that spring, though she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority you usually see in people 20 years older. Light brown hair worn in a single braid that hung over her left shoulder, hazel eyes that missed nothing. She was the kind of woman who wore Danner hiking boots under her teaching outfit and kept a pair of Nikon binoculars on her desk next to the pencil sharpener. Her classroom had a terrarium with a garter snake, a shelf of animal skulls she had found over the years, and a poster of the Idaho wilderness that took up the entire back wall. The other teachers had posters of the alphabet and motivational slogans. Lisa had a topographic map of the Selkirk Range. She had grown up in Sandpoint, about an hour north, in a family that practically lived outdoors. Her father, James Moore, had been a Forest Service ranger for 28 years before he retired. Her mother, Carol, was a wildlife rehabilitator who ran an informal raptor sanctuary out of their garage. You could not visit the Moore house without hearing a red-tailed hawk screaming from a recovery cage or stepping over a box of orphaned voles being raised for release. Lisa had absorbed all of that knowledge the way most children absorb Saturday morning cartoons, through daily repetition until it became instinct. She could identify a bird by its silhouette at 300 yards. She could read animal tracks the way a detective reads a crime scene, noting the depth of the impression, the spacing of the stride, the distribution of weight, the story each mark told about speed and size and intention. She was not a survivalist or a prepper. She was simply someone who understood the forest at a level that most people never achieve, and that understanding made her both an extraordinary teacher and, eventually, the kind of person who could survive alone in the Idaho wilderness for 15 years. Every spring, Lisa organized a 3-day outdoor education trip for her fourth graders. This was not a field trip to a museum or a nature center. Lisa took her students into the backcountry, real wilderness. Canvas tents, cooking over campfires, orienteering with compasses, collecting water samples, identifying plants and insects. The parents loved it. The kids came back with dirty fingernails and wider eyes and the kind of confidence that only comes from sleeping outside and realizing you can handle it. The other teachers grumbled that it set an impossible standard. I privately agreed with them, but I also understood that what Lisa was doing was the purest form of education I had ever witnessed. The trip that year was scheduled for May 16th through the 18th, a Monday through Wednesday. Lisa had chosen a site in the St. Joe National Forest, southeast of town, a place she had used twice before. The campsite sat in a meadow beside a creek about 4 miles from the nearest logging road. To reach it, you hiked a maintained trail for about 2.5 miles, then followed a game trail through a stretch of old-growth western red cedar that opened into the meadow like a door into another century. I remember walking through those cedars on the hike-in and feeling the temperature drop at least 10 degrees. The air going from warm spring sunshine to cool, damp stillness that smelled like earth and resin and centuries of undisturbed decomposition. The trunks were immense, some of them 8 or 9 feet in diameter, and the bark was deeply furrowed and dark with moisture, and the canopy was so thick overhead that the light had a greenish underwater quality that made you feel like you were walking through a cathedral that had been growing instead of built. We brought 23 students, Lisa as the lead teacher, myself as the administrative chaperone, and 3 parent volunteers. Dave Miller owned a plumbing business and had forearms like cedar posts. Sharon Allen was a nurse at Kootenai Medical Center who carried a first aid kit the size of a suitcase. Tom Clark worked at the Potlatch lumber mill and had hunted elk in those mountains since he was old enough to hold a rifle. Between us, we had over a century of combined backcountry experience. That fact would later make Lisa's disappearance almost impossible to explain to the people who investigated it, because we were not a group of novices who got in over our heads. We knew exactly what we were doing. What we did not know was what else was out there with us. The first day went exactly as Lisa had planned. The hike-in was gorgeous mid-May in the Idaho Panhandle, with the dogwood in bloom and the creek running fast with the last of the snowmelt. The kids handled the terrain better than I expected, though we carried 2 backpacks for students who hit the wall around the 1.5-mile mark. One boy, a redhead named Kevin White, whose father managed the IGA grocery on 4th Street, threw up his lunch about 20 minutes into the hike. Sharon Allen handled it with the unflappable efficiency of a woman who had seen worse in the emergency room at 2 in the morning, and Kevin was back on his feet within 5 minutes, embarrassed but functional. Lisa led the group with the confidence of someone walking through her own living room. She stopped every few hundred yards to point out a shelf fungus on a fallen log, or a pileated woodpecker working a dead snag with a rhythm like a tiny jackhammer, or the way the creek changed from a broad, shallow riffle to a narrow, deep chute where the gradient steepened. She picked up a stone from the creek bank, turned it over, and showed the kids the caddisfly larvae clinging to the underside in their tiny stone houses. She pointed to a set of tracks in the mud and walked the students through the identification process: the 5 toes, the claw marks, the oval pad. "Black bear," she said. "Probably a sow, based on the size. She came through here this morning, heading upstream to fish." The kids stared at the tracks like they were looking at dinosaur fossils. By the time we reached the meadow and started setting up camp, the children were vibrating with the kind of energy that comes from genuine discovery. This was not the restless, destructive energy of kids who have eaten too much candy. This was the focused, burning curiosity of young minds that had been shown something real and wanted more. Lisa had created that. It was her gift. and watching her do it was like watching a master musician play an instrument they had spent their whole life learning. That first night was clear and cold. The thermometer on Tom Clark's Timex read 38 degrees by the time the last kid was zipped into a sleeping bag. We had a campfire going until about 9, and Lisa sat cross-legged on a Crazy Creek camp chair and told the kids about the Coeur d'Alene tribe and their relationship with the land we were camped on. She talked about how the tribe understood the forest as a community of interconnected lives, how the trees shared nutrients through underground fungal networks, how the animals had their own social structures and territories and hierarchies. She described how the elders taught that certain places in the mountains were inhabited by beings that were not human and not animal, but something in between, something older than either, and that the proper response to encountering such beings was not fear, but respect. I remember watching the kids' faces in the firelight, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open, and I remember thinking that this was education stripped down to its most essential form. A person who knew something important, sharing it with people who were young enough to receive it without the filters that adulthood would eventually install. The second day, Tuesday, is where everything began to change, though none of us understood it at the time. Lisa had planned a nature walk along the creek for the morning, with the kids collecting water samples and identifying aquatic invertebrates as part of a stream ecology unit. We broke into 3 groups. Lisa took one group upstream, I took one downstream, and Dave Miller supervised the third near camp. Sharon and Tom floated between groups, helping where needed. It was during the morning session around 10:15 that Lisa came back to camp looking different, not frightened, not even alarmed, thoughtful, the way she got when she was working through a problem that did not have an obvious solution. She pulled me aside while the kids were eating lunch. PB&J sandwiches and juice boxes and those little bags of Fritos that came 24 to a box from Albertsons. I can still smell the peanut butter and corn chips mixed with the creek water and pine resin. These are the details that anchor a memory, the small, ordinary things that surround the impossible. I found something upstream, she said. Tracks, about 300 yards past the bend where the creek goes around the big cedar with the split trunk. What kind of tracks? She paused. Lisa Moore did not pause. She was the most direct person I have ever known. If a kid was failing math, she told the parents on the first phone call. If a colleague was not pulling their weight, she said so in the staff meeting. Hesitation was not part of her operating system, so when she paused, I felt something shift in my stomach, the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. Footprints, she said, barefoot, roughly 16 inches long and 7 inches across at the ball. 5 toes with clear pad impressions, deep heel strike. The stride length is between 55 and 60 inches. I asked if it could be a bear. She gave me a look I had seen her give students who confused cumulus clouds with cumulonimbus. Patient disappointment. Bears don't have 5 toes arranged in a human configuration, Paul. Bears don't walk with a consistent bipedal stride of nearly 5 feet. And bears don't leave impressions this deep unless they weigh at least 400 pounds. And a 400-pound bear would leave claw marks, which these prints do not have. I wanted to go look immediately, but we had 23 children to supervise, and the afternoon activity was a plant identification scavenger hunt that required all hands. Lisa agreed to let it go until after the kids were settled for the night. She was practical above all else. Whatever had made those tracks was not an immediate threat to the children, and the educational mission took priority. But I noticed something in her eyes that I had never seen before, a brightness that went beyond professional curiosity, a hunger that reminded me of the way her mother's hawks looked when they spotted prey from across a field. That afternoon was uneventful on the surface, but underneath the normal routine of teaching and supervising, I could feel a current running. Lisa was scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. She would stop mid-sentence during a lesson about Pacific yew bark, her eyes tracking something at the edge of the meadow, then resume as if nothing had happened. At one point I followed her gaze and saw nothing but the darkness between the cedar trunks and the slow movement of fern fronds in a breeze I could not feel. But Lisa had spent her entire life reading forests the way other people read newspapers, and if she was watching something, there was something there. Here is what you need to understand about that Tuesday night, because it was the first night, and the first night set the pattern for everything that followed. After dinner, once the kids were in their tents, and the parent volunteers were stationed at the campfire for the evening watch rotation, Lisa and I hiked upstream to the track site. We brought flashlights, though there was still enough twilight to see. May dusk in northern Idaho hangs on forever, a long blue hour that stretches the shadows until they dissolve into general darkness. The creek was loud with snowmelt, and the sound of it covered our footsteps as we picked our way along the bank. The air smelled like wet stone and crushed devil's club and the faint sweetness of cottonwood buds, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. Lisa stopped at the bend she had described near the split cedar. She angled her flashlight at the mud bank, and I saw the prints immediately, 5 of them, moving upstream along the soft alluvial mud of the creek bank. Each one was exactly as she described, and seeing them in person was a fundamentally different experience from hearing the measurements. The proportions were human. 5 toes, a ball, an arch, a deep heel strike, but the scale was grotesque. I set my size 11 Danner boot inside the nearest print, and there was room on every side. The print dwarfed my foot the way an adult's hand dwarfs an infant's, and the spacing between them, the distance from one heel strike to the next, was enormous. I measured it by pacing, close to 60 inches. Could be a hoax, I said, though the words felt thin even as I spoke them. We are 4 miles from the nearest road. Nobody has been up this creek since we arrived. There are no boot prints anywhere near these tracks. Whoever or whatever made these came from the forest above the creek, walked along the bank for about 40 yards, and went back into the forest. She crouched beside one of the prints and pressed her thumb into the mud. Her thumb barely dented the surface. The footprint was pressed nearly 2 inches deep. That is not a person in a costume, Paul. That is something that weighs 400 pounds at minimum, probably considerably more. She pointed to a detail I had missed. Look at the toe splay. See how the toes spread wider than a human foot? That is adaptation for soft terrain. More surface area, better weight distribution. And this one. She indicated the 3rd print, the clearest in the sequence. There is a deformity on the right foot, a bump on the outside edge below the 5th metatarsal, either a bunion or a healed fracture. Paul, this print has a medical history. This is an individual. I stood there with the creek roaring beside me and the last light draining out of the sky like water out of a bathtub, and I felt something that I had not felt since I was 6 years old and my father took me camping for the first time. Not fear, exactly. Something older and more fundamental. The sudden, unwelcome recognition that the darkness around me contained something I did not understand and could not control, and that all of my education and experience and administrative authority meant absolutely nothing in the face of it. We hiked back to camp. Lisa was quiet, and I could practically hear the gears turning inside her head, processing what we had seen, fitting it into frameworks I did not have. That was the first night. Here is the second. Tuesday night, 2 in the morning. Tom Clark shook me awake inside my tent. His face in the flashlight beam was the color of old paper. Tom was a man who had shot bull elk at 20 yards and gutted them where they fell, and he was frightened in a way I had never seen him frightened before. "Something is out there," he whispered. "West side, past the tree line. It's been moving back and forth for 20 minutes. I pulled on my boots and followed him to the campfire, which had burned down to a bed of coals that pulsed orange in the darkness like a slow heartbeat. Tom pointed toward the western edge of the meadow, where the grass ended and the forest began. The moon was 3/4 full, and the meadow was flooded with silver light that turned the grass into a luminous carpet. At first I saw nothing. The tree line was a wall of shadow, impenetrable. Then Tom gripped my arm, and I saw it. Something large, upright, moving with a slow, deliberate lateral motion along the edge of the trees, staying just inside the shadow but occasionally crossing a gap where the moonlight penetrated the canopy. The silhouette was broad-shouldered and tall, at least a head taller than any man I had ever seen, and it maintained its upright posture continuously, not rising and falling the way a bear does when it stands on its hind legs, but walking with the sustained bipedal fluidity of something that had always walked on 2 legs. It moved the way a nervous parent paces outside a hospital room, back and forth along the same stretch of tree line, pausing occasionally to face the camp before resuming its patrol. We watched for 10 minutes. It never came closer. It never made a sound. Then it turned and moved deeper into the trees, and the forest absorbed it the way a lake absorbs a stone. Tom looked at me. "What was that?" "I don't know." And for the first time in my career as a school administrator, a job that required having an answer for everything, I was telling the absolute truth. I did not tell Lisa about the sighting. I should have. But I told myself it was because I did not want to cause alarm, and that was only half the lie. The other half was that I was afraid of what Lisa would do with the information, because I had seen the look in her eyes at the track site, and I recognized it. It was the look of someone who has found the thing they were born to pursue, and the last thing that look needed was more fuel. The third night changed everything. Wednesday was the last day of the trip. We were supposed to break camp after breakfast, hike out, and be back at the school by mid-afternoon for parent pickup. Lisa had taken the early watch, 4 to 6 in the morning. When I crawled out of my tent at 6:15, she was standing at the edge of the meadow with her back to the camp and her braid undone, her hair loose around her shoulders, and there was a stillness about her that I had never seen in another human being. She looked like a person who had just had a conversation with God and was still processing the content. "Lisa, everything okay?" She turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but not with tears, with intensity, a brightness that bordered on something I can only call revelation. "It came to the edge of the trees, Paul, 60 feet from where I was sitting. It stood there for almost 40 minutes. I could see its face." "What did it look like?" She took a breath and let it out slowly, as if she were choosing her words from a very large and very private vocabulary. "It looked like it was carrying something heavy, not physically, emotionally. It looked at the camp the way my mother looks at old photographs of my father, like it was remembering something that used to be there and isn't anymore. It looked lonely, Paul. It looked so lonely that I wanted to walk over to it and tell it that I understood. Tell it what you understood. What it feels like to be the only one of your kind in a room." I told her we needed to focus on getting the kids home. She nodded and snapped back into teacher mode with an efficiency that should have reassured me, but didn't. Something had unlocked inside Lisa Moore during that pre-dawn vigil, and I could see it in the way she kept glancing back over her shoulder as we broke camp, the way her hands slowed on the tent stakes, the way she lingered at the rear of the group on the hike out, and twice stopped on the trail to look back the way we had come, with an expression that I would not fully understand for another 15 years. It was not nostalgia, it was not wistfulness. It was the look of someone who has found their home and is being forced to walk away from it. We returned the students to the school without incident. Parents collected their kids in the parking lot. The volunteers loaded their gear into their trucks, and I went home to my house on Mullen Avenue and sat in my lazy boy recliner and drank a Rainier beer and stared at the wall and tried to convince myself that what I had seen in those mountains had a rational explanation. A person in a costume, a misidentified bear, a trick of moonlight and exhaustion and the power of suggestion. None of these explanations survived contact with what I had actually witnessed, but I repeated them anyway, the way you might repeat a prayer you no longer believe in, because the ritual itself provides a kind of comfort, even when the words have gone hollow. 3 days later, Saturday morning, 7 a.m., Lisa called me at home. She said she was going back to the campsite, alone. She wanted to study the tracks more carefully, take plaster casts, photograph the area. She had been doing research at the Coeur d'Alene Public Library, reading everything she could find about Sasquatch sightings in the northern Rockies, and she believed what we had seen was consistent with reports going back decades. Reports from loggers and hunters and Forest Service personnel, people with credibility and nothing to gain from lying. I told her it was a terrible idea. Going alone into remote wilderness to investigate an unknown large animal was reckless, and I used that exact word. She listened with the patience of someone who has already made their decision and is simply being polite about letting you finish your objection. Paul, I have been hiking alone in these mountains since I was 14 years old. I know the risks better than anyone. But this is important. This might be the most important thing I will ever encounter. I need to go back. I asked her to at least tell someone else where she was going. She said she would tell her mother. She said she would be back by Sunday evening. She was not back by Sunday evening. She was not back by Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, when she failed to show up at school and did not answer her home phone, I called the Shoshone County Sheriff's Office and reported her missing. The search lasted 11 days. They brought in 3 tracking dog teams, a search and rescue helicopter, volunteer teams from 3 counties, and 2 tracking specialists from Idaho Fish and Game. The operation ran from a command post at the trailhead parking area, where Lisa's 1984 Toyota Tercel sat exactly where she had left it. They found her campsite. Her tent was still standing, properly staked, the rain fly taut. Her gear was organized with the meticulous precision I recognized from her classroom. Her food was stored in a proper bear hang, 30 feet up and 10 feet from the trunk, exactly as the guidelines recommended. Her boots were beside the tent entrance. Her cooking gear was clean. Her water bottle was full. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no scattered equipment. Everything about the campsite said that its occupant had left voluntarily and expected to return. They found her notebook, 12 pages of detailed sketches and measurements documenting the tracks she had found, with annotations about stride length, toe splay, depth of impression, and estimated body weight. The search coordinator, a Fish and Game lieutenant named Steve Green, looked at those pages and then looked at me and said, "What was she doing out here, Paul?" And I told him the truth, which was that she was studying animal tracks. And I did not tell him the rest of the truth, which was that the animal whose tracks she was studying should not exist. The tracking dogs found footprints around her camp, her small boot prints, which matched the Merrill's she had left by the tent, and the other prints, the huge barefoot impressions, 5 toes, deep heel strike, stride length of nearly 5 feet, leading from the creek bank up the slope above the camp and into a drainage choked with old-growth timber and blowdown so dense that light barely penetrated. The dogs followed the trail to the edge of that timber and stopped. All 3 dogs from 3 different agencies, trained by 3 different handlers, exhibited the same behavior. They approached the tree line, whined, tucked their tails against their bellies, and refused to go further. One of the handlers, a woman named Kelly Davis, who had worked dog teams for 17 years, told me privately that she had never seen all three dogs refuse simultaneously. Dogs don't do that because of a bear or a cougar, she said. They do that when the scent triggers something they can't categorize, something that tells them they're not the biggest thing in the woods. The search was called off on June 1st. The official report concluded Lisa had likely been attacked by a mountain lion, and her remains scattered in a location too remote to recover. This conclusion required ignoring the undisturbed campsite, the absence of blood, the voluntarily removed boots, the confiscated notebook, and the oversized barefoot prints, photographed and then attributed to an unidentified individual walking barefoot in the area. That sentence is the kind of deliberate nonsense bureaucracies produce when the truth is too inconvenient to acknowledge. Lisa's parents were devastated in the way that only parents of missing children can be, a devastation that is different from grief, because grief has a floor and the not knowing does not. Her mother, Carol, that tough, practical woman who had spent decades nursing injured hawks back to flight with her bare hands, seemed to shrink physically in the months after the disappearance. She kept Lisa's room exactly as it had been, the hiking boots by the door, the field guides on the shelf, the topographic maps pinned to the wall. Her father, James, the retired ranger, went into the mountains himself. Again and again, week after week, walking grid patterns through terrain that the official search had already covered, carrying a day pack and a whistle and a hope that diminished with each empty return. He searched for 6 years. His heart gave out in January of 1994, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in his truck at the St. Joe trailhead, the engine running and the heater on, and a thermos of coffee going cold on the seat beside him. The county coroner said it was a fatal coronary event. Lisa's mother told me at the funeral that she believed the mountains had killed him, that he had pushed his 68-year-old body past its limits, walking those ridges and drainages in every season, and that his heart had simply run out of the fuel it needed to keep beating. I left Ridgeview the following year. I took a principal position in Boise, 400 miles south, where the landscape was sage and basalt instead of cedar and glacial silence. I told myself I was advancing my career. The truth was simpler. I could not drive past the St. Joe turnoff without feeling a weight in my chest that made breathing difficult, and the only solution I could find was distance. For 15 years, I thought about her the way you think about a locked room in a house you live in. You know it is there. You walk past it every day. You hear sounds behind the door that you tell yourself are the wind or the pipes or the settling of old wood. You do not open the door because you know that whatever is behind it will change the shape of every room in the house, and you are not ready for that. You may never be ready for that, but the door is always there, and so is the sound, and eventually the not opening becomes its own kind of weight that is heavier than whatever the opening would bring. Then, in the summer of 2003, I went back. My reason for returning was ordinary. My mother, who still lived in Coeur d'Alene, had fallen and broken her hip. I drove up from Boise to help her through the surgery and recovery. She was 79, proud, and furious about needing a walker, and the combination of her stubbornness and her pain medication made the first week a test of endurance for both of us. But by the second week, she was mobile enough and irritable enough to insist that I stop hovering, and I found myself with empty hours and a restlessness I could not explain. I had not been to the St. Joe in 15 years. I had told myself I would never go back, but the body has its own memory, and mine was pulling me north and east toward the mountains with a force that felt less like a decision and more like a current. I drove to the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. The parking area looked the same, maybe a little more overgrown, the gravel surface colonized by knapweed and mullein. I laced up my boots, shouldered a day pack with water and a sandwich and a first aid kit, and started walking. I told myself I was going for a hike, just exercise, fresh air, a middle-aged man revisiting a place from his younger days. The lie was so transparent that even the Stellar's jays, screaming from the cedars, seemed to see through it. The trail was quieter than I remembered. Mid-July meant the snowmelt was done and the creek was running low, exposing gravel bars and rock shelves that would have been underwater in May. The old-growth cedars were still standing, their trunks as wide as Volkswagen Beetles and furrowed like the faces of very old men. The air beneath them was cool and still and smelled like earth and resin and the slow, patient work of centuries. I reached the meadow campsite in about 90 minutes. The fire ring was still there, just a circle of blackened stones, but the meadow was smaller than I remembered, invaded by young alders and wild rose that were reclaiming the open ground with the quiet determination of nature, erasing the evidence of human presence. I sat on a log and ate my sandwich and drank water and told myself this was enough. I had come back. I had faced the place. I could leave now and call it closure, except my feet disagreed with my brain. They carried me upstream along the creek, past the split cedar, and beyond it into country I had never explored. The valley narrowed, the slopes steepened, the canopy closed overhead, and the air dropped 10 degrees and took on the smell of wet rock and fungus and soil that had not been disturbed in a very long time. I hiked for 2 hours past the old campsite, deeper than I had any business going alone at 59 with complaining knees. Devil's clubs snagged my sleeves and left tiny welts on my wrists. A grouse exploded from a thicket 3 feet from my face. The creek narrowed and the sound of it changed from a broad rushing to a concentrated roar. I was about to turn back. My watch said 2:45 and I had at least 3 hours of hiking to get back to the truck before dark. That was when I smelled smoke, not wildfire smoke, not the acrid, panicky smell of uncontrolled burning. This was campfire smoke, the sweet, distinctive scent of cedar bark catching and burning, a smell I knew from 1,000 campfires in 1,000 backcountry camps. It was coming from somewhere up the slope to my left, carried on a draft of air that moved down through the trees and across the creek. I stopped, listened. The creek was loud enough to mask most sounds, but in a gap between water surges, I heard something that pinned me to the ground as completely as if someone had driven a nail through each of my boots. A voice. A woman's voice. Speaking or humming or something in between in a tone that rose and fell in a cadence I did not recognize as language or song, but that carried an emotion I recognized immediately and without ambiguity. Tenderness. The sound of someone caring for something fragile. My legs moved before my mind authorized the motion. I left the creek bank and started climbing the slope, pulling myself up through Devil's Club and Vine Maple, following the smoke smell and the voice. The undergrowth thinned as I gained elevation, replaced by a carpet of moss and decomposing needles that cushioned my footsteps. The voice grew clearer. It was a rhythmic murmuring, not words I could identify, pitched low and steady, the kind of sound you might make to soothe a frightened animal or a sick child. It had a quality I can only describe as ancient, as if it belonged to a tradition of caregiving that predated language and survived in the body the way breathing survives, automatic, essential, beyond the need for thought. I crested a small ridge and found myself looking down into a shallow basin about 40 feet across, sheltered by rock outcroppings and roofed by massive cedars. There was a fire pit, a small fire burning drying racks with strips of fish and plant material, woven grass mats on the ground with intricate patterns, a lean-to shelter built against the rock face with craftsmanship that would shed rain efficiently, clay pots near the fire containing liquids and pastes. The whole arrangement looked like a museum exhibit about pre-contact indigenous life, except it was not an exhibit. It was occupied. And at the back of the basin, in the deep shade of the rock overhang, was Lisa Moore. I have already described how she looked, but what I felt is harder to put into words. Standing on that ridge looking down at a dead woman who was alive, the world I had inhabited for 15 years, where Lisa Moore was dead and the forest was just a forest, tilted on its axis and dumped me into a different reality. Then I saw what she was crouched beside, and the vertigo became freefall. The creature was lying on its side, and even curled in pain and exhaustion, it was staggering in scale. Over 7 feet long, covered in dense reddish-brown hair, darker on the back and lighter on the chest. Its body had the proportions of something designed for power: barrel chest, massive shoulders, arms longer than a human's and thicker than my thighs. Its hands were curled near its face, each one the size of a dinner plate, with thick fingers and broad, dark nails packed with soil. The face was a study in paradox. Flat nose, heavy brow ridge, recessed eyes, a jaw that projected forward slightly, all offset by a forehead that was unmistakably high and rounded in a way that spoke of intelligence. It existed in the exact middle of a spectrum, with human at one end and animal at the other, and occupied that space with a completeness that made both endpoints seem like oversimplifications. It was breathing in shallow, labored rhythm. The wound on its left leg above the knee was visible even from where I stood. Swollen flesh, discolored skin where the hair had been pulled back, a glistening wetness that could be either serum or pus. The smell reached me on the ridge, a thick, musky odor that was partly animal and partly infection and partly something else, something herbal and sharp that I would learn came from the medicines Lisa was making. I must have shifted my weight because a stone rolled under my foot and clattered down the slope, and Lisa's head snapped up and her eyes locked on mine. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The creature stirred, and Lisa's hands went to its shoulder immediately, pressing gently, making a low, vibrating hum that seemed to travel through her palms into the creature's body. It settled. Its breathing steadied. Then Lisa looked at me again, and recognition arrived in stages across her face, like clouds clearing to reveal a landscape. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that I think was a mixture of relief and terror. "Paul?" Her voice was rough, unused to volume. It sounded like an instrument that had not been played in a long time and needed tuning. "Paul Wright?" "Lisa." My own voice came out as a croak, stripped of everything except the bare fact of her name. She raised a finger to her lips. "Quiet. He is finally letting me help." She gestured for me to come down into the basin, slowly, and I descended on legs that felt borrowed. Up close, the creature's presence was overwhelming. Not just the size, though the size was staggering. The heat radiating from its body, the depth of its breathing, each exhale a warm gust that smelled of digested plants and something ferric like blood. The sheer physical reality of it, the weight it placed on the ground, the way the firelight caught the texture of its fur, the individual muscles visible beneath the hair of its shoulder as it shifted in its sleep. "Sit there," Lisa whispered, pointing to a woven mat about 10 feet from the creature's back. "No sudden movements, no loud sounds. He knows you are here. He's deciding." "Deciding what?" "Whether you are a threat." I sat. I watched Lisa work on the wound, cleaning it with water from a clay pot, applying a green paste with the careful, practiced movements of someone who had done this kind of work hundreds of times. She hummed continuously, that low, vibrating tone, and the creature's breathing slowed and deepened until it was asleep, its broad ribcage rising and falling in a rhythm that I could feel through the ground. When she finished, she rinsed her hands, dried them on her tunic, and sat across from me. The fire was between us, and in its light, She looked both older and more alive than anyone I had ever seen. "I suppose you want to know what happened," she said. "Lisa, your father searched for you until it killed him. Your mother is in Sandpoint, still waiting. The school held a memorial." Her face crumpled. For exactly 3 seconds, I saw the woman I had known. The teacher who wrote personal notes on every student's report card and cried at graduations and brought homemade cookies to staff meetings. Then the armor came back, assembled from 15 years of surviving things that would have destroyed most people. I know what I gave up. I have lived with that knowledge every single day. But you need to hear what happened, Paul, because if you truly hear it, you will understand why I stayed. She told me. She talked for 3 hours while the fire burned and the creature slept and the shadows moved across the basin, and what she described was not a disappearance. It was a calling. When she returned to the campsite that Saturday in May of '88, she had found more tracks, not just along the creek but on the slope above the meadow in a patch of soft duff beneath the cedars where something immense had been lying down. A body-shaped depression in the forest floor, 7 feet long, surrounded by crushed ferns and scattered bark. She spent the afternoon documenting everything with the thoroughness she brought to her lesson plans. By evening, she had filled 12 notebook pages with sketches and measurements. That night, alone at the campsite, she heard them. Not just one. At least 3 distinct vocalizations from different points around the meadow. Low, resonant calls that she described as something between a whale song and a foghorn, sounds that traveled through the ground as much as through the air. She could feel them in her chest and in the bones of her skull. She sat by her fire and did the only thing that made sense to her, the thing her mother had taught her about approaching frightened raptors. She matched their energy. She began humming in response, finding the pitch of the nearest call and holding it, showing the callers that she recognized their language, even if she could not speak it. Near dawn, one of them came. It approached from the upstream direction, moving through the brush with a deliberateness that told her it was choosing to be heard rather than choosing to be silent. It stopped about 50 feet from her camp, at the edge of the firelight. It was the same individual she had seen from the meadow during the school trip, the one she had described to me as looking lonely. Male, she believed, based on the breadth of its shoulders and the density of its facial hair. Approximately 7.5 feet tall, dark auburn hair that was longer on the head and shoulders and shorter on the limbs, with silver threads at the temples that caught the firelight. It stood there watching her with an expression she would spend years learning to interpret, an expression of intelligence so acute that being observed by it felt like being weighed on a scale she had never known existed. She stayed still. She kept humming. The creature took 3 steps closer, stopped. 3 more, stopped. It covered the 50 feet between them in increments over the course of an hour, and by the time the sun was fully up, it was standing 12 feet from her fire, close enough for her to see the way its nostrils flared as it took in her scent, close enough to hear the low vibration in its chest that she would later learn was a sound of cautious acceptance. It reached out one enormous hand, palm up, and held it there. Lisa described this moment as the hinge of her entire life. Everything before it swung in one direction, everything after swung in the other. She reached out and placed her hand on its palm. The skin was warm, dry, heavily calloused, and the texture of it was like the bark of a madrone tree, smooth in some places and rough in others. Its fingers curled around hers with a pressure that was firm but calibrated, strong enough to communicate intent and gentle enough to communicate choice. They stayed like that for maybe a minute. Then the creature released her hand, turned, and walked back into the forest with a stride that covered ground so efficiently it was out of sight within seconds. Lisa sat by her dead fire for 3 hours after it left. She told me she made her decision during those 3 hours, and that it was not a dramatic moment of revelation, but a quiet recognition of something she had known without being able to name it for her entire life. She was going to follow it. She packed her camp gear, left her boots because the terrain ahead was too steep and irregular for stiff soles, and she needed to feel the ground beneath her to move safely, and she followed the faint trail of broken ferns and scuffed bark up the slope and into the deep timber. She lost it within the first hour. The creature moved through terrain that would stop a mountain goat, but she kept tracking, following turned stones, broken branches, footprints in mud seeps. By late afternoon, she had covered 3 miles of brutal country and found herself in the creek drainage, where I would eventually find her, a narrow valley with vertical walls and light filtered green through dense canopy. That was where she found the first shelter. Not the basin where I found her, but an earlier site, a rock overhang showing signs of repeated occupation, flattened grass, worn paths between the overhang and the water, scat that she examined with the same clinical detachment she had learned cataloging owl pellets with her mother. The scat was substantial and contained plant fiber, fish bones, and berry seeds, and it was not bear scat. The composition was wrong. She made camp and waited. 2 days. She ate the food she had packed and supplemented with watercress from the creek and huckleberries from a nearby slope. On the second night, the creature returned. It arrived carrying a bundle of fresh-caught trout, 5 of them threaded on a willow branch. It placed them on the ground between the overhang and Lisa's camp, then retreated to the tree line and sat down. It watched her. She watched it. After an hour, Lisa walked slowly to the fish, carried them back, cleaned them, built a fire, cooked them, ate 2, and placed the remaining 3 on a flat rock near the creature. It ate them, and the sound of the bones crunching between its teeth carried across the 30 feet between them with a startling clarity. This became their pattern. The creature brought food, fish, or occasionally bundles of roots that Lisa identified as camas and bitterroot, staples of the indigenous diet in that region for thousands of years. Lisa prepared the food. Over the following weeks, the distance between them shrank by inches. By mid-June, they were eating within arm's reach, and the creature had begun making vocalizations that Lisa came to understand as a rudimentary communication system. Low hums for contentment, a sharp bark for warning, a rising, questioning tone for inquiry, a sustained, vibrating moan that she eventually recognized as grief. The creature was alone. Lisa understood this gradually through accumulated evidence that assembled into a picture she could not deny. The multiple vocalizations she had heard on her first night, the ones that seemed to come from different points around the meadow, had not been multiple individuals. They had been this one creature, moving through the forest and calling, its voice echoing off the rock walls to create the illusion of company it did not have. It was calling for others of its kind. It had been calling for a very long time, and nobody was answering. Lisa named him Samuel. She told me the name was purely for her own reference, and that the creature had no concept of human naming. She chose Samuel because it meant God has heard, and she said that when she watched him calling into the empty forest, night after night, sending out sounds that traveled for miles and returned with nothing but echoes, she prayed that something, somewhere, was listening. By late summer, Lisa had moved with Samuel to the basin where I found her. It was better sheltered with natural windbreaks, reliable water, and enough flat ground for a permanent camp. And by that point, she had made her choice. She was staying, not temporarily, not as a research project with an end date, permanently. Because if I reported this, she told me, they would come for him, scientists first, with tranquilizer darts and satellite collars and peer-reviewed intentions, then television crews, then the government, because a creature like Samuel would be classified as either a protected species requiring containment or a national security anomaly requiring study, and either way the result would be the same. He would lose the only thing he has left: his freedom, his dignity, the right to exist on his own terms in the place where his kind have existed for longer than our civilization has had a name. "But your family," I said, "your life." My father was a Forest Service ranger. His entire career was protecting things that could not protect themselves. My mother rehabilitates injured animals that most people would leave to die on the roadside. This is what my family does. Paul, this is what I was raised to do. I just never expected the creature that needed protecting to be the one that everybody thinks is a myth. She told me about the first winter, and I will tell it to you the way she told it to me, because it deserves to be heard as a story, not summarized as a fact. Snow came in mid-October of '88, weeks earlier than usual. Lisa had spent September and early October in a frenzy of preparation that she compared to the canning season she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen in Sandpoint. She dried fish on the racks, slicing the flesh thin so it would cure in the autumn sun. She gathered camas root, bitterroot, huckleberries, service berries, and the inner bark of certain pine trees that she knew from her father's teachings were edible in winter when other food sources failed. She wove grass mats for insulation and stored everything she could in clay pots sealed with pine pitch. She built the lean-to shelter against the rock face, dragging logs from the surrounding forest by hand, a process that took weeks and left her palms blistered and her shoulders aching in a way that made sleep difficult. Samuel helped. She described his participation in the camp construction as tentative at first, as if he were unsure whether his help was welcome or appropriate. But when he saw her struggling with a log that was too heavy to move, he walked over, picked it up with one hand the way a person might pick up a broom, and carried it to the shelter site. He set it down and looked at her with an expression she interpreted as a question. She pointed to where the log needed to go. He placed it there. After that, the heavy work became a collaboration, Lisa directing and Samuel executing with a strength that was almost casual in its enormity. He lifted things that weighed 300 pounds with the same effort Lisa used to lift a coffee cup, and he placed them with a precision that suggested an understanding of structural engineering that was intuitive rather than learned. The first real storm hit on October 23rd. Lisa remembered the date because she had been tracking the days by carving notches in a log, and she counted them later. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours, and the snow came sideways, driven by a wind that roared through the drainage and shook the cedars hard enough to drop branches the size of her arm. Lisa was inside the lean-to, feeding the fire and hoping the shelter would hold when Samuel appeared at the entrance. He had been somewhere in the forest, doing whatever he did when he left the basin for hours or days at a time, and he was covered in snow and shaking, not with cold, but with something she recognized from her mother's raptors: agitation. He had known the storm was coming. He had come back to check on her. He ducked into the lean-to, and the space that had seemed adequate for one person became very small. Samuel's body generated heat like a wood stove, and within minutes the interior of the shelter was warm enough that Lisa's breath stopped fogging. He sat with his back against the rock wall, his legs drawn up, his thick arms wrapped around his knees, and he watched the storm through the shelter entrance with those deep amber eyes that seemed to process information on a level Lisa could not access. At some point during that first night, as the wind screamed and the snow piled up outside the entrance and the fire crackled between them, Lisa realized she was not afraid. She was not even uncomfortable. She was, for the first time in her adult life, exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, and the storm outside was simply weather, and the creature beside her was simply a companion, and the life she had left behind was simply a draft that had been superseded by a final version. The winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time. The creek froze solid and Lisa had to melt snow for water. The food stores dwindled despite careful rationing, and there were days in February when she ate nothing but pine bark tea and a handful of dried berries. She lost weight until her hip bones protruded, and her ribs were visible beneath her skin. Her feet developed chilblains that cracked and bled and made walking feel like stepping on broken glass. She developed a cough in January that lasted 6 weeks and left her so weak that climbing the slope to gather firewood required rest stops every 20 feet. Samuel did things during that winter that she would never be able to explain to anyone who had not witnessed them. On the coldest nights when the temperature was 20 below and the wind chill was worse, he would move his body to the windward side of the shelter, using his mass as a windbreak. He brought her food when she was too sick to forage, appearing with bundles of frozen fish that he had somehow obtained from a creek that Lisa was certain was frozen solid, and she concluded that he had knowledge of open water sources in the drainage that she had not discovered. When her cough was at its worst, he would sit beside her and place one broad hand on her back, and the heat from his palm would penetrate through her hide clothing and into her muscles, and the warmth eased the spasms in a way that felt intentional, as if he understood that heat was a treatment for what ailed her. One night in late January, during the worst cold snap, Lisa woke to find Samuel sitting upright in the darkness of the lean-to, making a sound she had never heard, a low, sustained tone that was not quite humming and not quite singing, a vibration that seemed to come from his entire body rather than just his throat. The sound filled the shelter and reverberated off the rock wall and entered Lisa's chest and settled there, and she felt the fear and the hunger and the bone-deep cold recede as if they were being physically pushed back by the frequency. She lay there listening, and the sound continued for what she estimated was 2 hours, and during those 2 hours she was warm and calm and certain that she would survive the winter, and she had no rational basis for that certainty except the sound itself. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived with a ferocity that matched the winter. The snow melted in sheets, the creek roared back to life, the meadows above the basin erupted with glacier lilies and shooting stars, and the first green shoots of commas pushing through the mud. Lisa described the feeling of that first warm day as a joy so absolute it was almost painful, the way blood returning to a frozen hand brings both relief and agony simultaneously. She stood in the basin and tipped her face to the sun and cried, and Samuel stood beside her, not touching her, just present, and that was enough. The years accumulated the way seasons accumulate, each one leaving its mark on the landscape and the people in it. Lisa developed systems. She tracked time by notches on a log, marking solstices and equinoxes by the position of the sun against natural landmarks on the ridgeline. She made clothing from deer hides that Samuel brought to the basin, teaching herself to tan leather using a process of braining and smoking reconstructed from fragments of books and her mother's descriptions. She used bone needles and sinew for thread, made moccasins that wore out every 3 months, and built a second lean-to for storage and a drying shed for meat. She learned medicine. Her mother's knowledge of herbal remedies was the foundation, expanded through careful self-experimentation. Plantain for cuts, yarrow for bleeding, Oregon grapefruit for infections, willow bark for pain, devil's club for coughs. She treated her own injuries and Samuel's too, because he was not invulnerable. He cut himself on rocks, developed abscesses from thorns, and once dislocated 2 fingers that Lisa splinted with sticks and hide strips, a procedure he endured with stoic patience that reminded her of her father in the dentist's chair. Samuel developed habits that Lisa came to read as personality. He had a specific spot by the creek where he sat every morning, a flat rock that caught the first sunlight and he would sit there for 20 minutes to half an hour, motionless, watching the water. He had a fondness for huckleberries that bordered on obsession, and during berry season, he would return to the basin with his hands and face stained purple and an expression of contentment that Lisa said was the closest thing to a human smile she ever saw on his face. He was afraid of thunder, not cowering afraid, but watchful and tense, and during electrical storms he would stay close to Lisa and make a low, continuous sound that she interpreted as unease. He was curious about Lisa's fire-making in a way that never diminished. Every time she struck a spark from her flint and steel, he would lean forward and watch the process with the rapt attention of a child watching a magic trick for the 100th time. His vocalizations grew more complex over the years, or perhaps Lisa's ability to interpret them grew more sophisticated. By the time I found her, she had identified over 40 distinct sounds, each with a specific meaning. Danger, food, water, sleep, come, go, stay, pain, contentment, anger, fear, grief, curiosity, affection, and compound expressions that did not have English equivalents. Emotional states she described with paired words: sad remembering, happy tired, worried about weather, missing someone who is gone. That last one was the most common. Samuel used it every night when he would stand at the edge of the basin and call into the darkness with sounds that traveled for miles, and the only answer was his own echo returning from the rock walls of the drainage, diminished and distorted, a mockery of the companionship it was meant to summon. Lisa told me all of this while the fire burned down and Samuel slept and the stars appeared through the gaps in the cedar canopy. She spoke with a matter-of-factness that I found both admirable and heartbreaking, the tone of someone who has lived with extraordinary circumstances for so long that they have become ordinary. When she finished, the fire was embers and the basin was dark except for the starlight, and Samuel's breathing was deep and regular, and the infection on his leg was still seeping through the bandage she had applied. "The wound," I said. "That is why you are telling me this." She nodded. "He fell 2 weeks ago, climbing a rock face to reach a beehive. He loves honey the way a child loves candy, and he will take risks for it that he would not take for anything else. A section of rock gave way under his foot, and he fell about 15 feet and gashed his leg on an outcrop. I stitched it with sinew and a bone needle. The stitching held, but the infection went deep. It is in the tissue, maybe the bone. I have been treating it with plantain and Oregon grapefruit and yarrow compresses, and they are not enough. Paul, I need real medicine. I need antibiotics." Here is the thing you need to understand about that moment. I was sitting in a rock shelter in the Idaho wilderness with a woman who had been declared dead 15 years earlier, next to a creature that every biology textbook in every school I had ever worked in said could not exist. Every protocol I had been trained to follow as an educator, as a citizen, as a person who believed in institutions and procedures, told me to hike out of that basin, call the authorities, and report what I had found. That was the right thing to do. That was what the rules said. And the rules had been my whole life. I was an administrator. Rules were what I did. But the rules had not sat with Lisa through a winter that nearly killed her. The rules had not watched Samuel bring her fish when she was too sick to feed herself. The rules had not heard the sound he made in the darkness that pushed back the cold and the fear. The rules did not know what I knew standing in that basin, which was that the moment I reported what I had found, a machinery would engage that would grind everything in this basin into data points and specimens and classified files, and the woman and the creature who had built a life together in defiance of everything the world assumed about what was possible would be separated, studied, and destroyed. Maybe not physically, but in every way that mattered. I told Lisa I would help. I told her I would bring medicine and supplies and that I would keep her secret. She cried then. Not dramatically, quiet tears that tracked through the dirt on her face and soaked into the leather of her tunic. She reached out and squeezed my hand, and the strength in her grip was startling, the calluses on her palm as hard and thick as the leather she wore. I hiked out the next morning. I needed broad-spectrum antibiotics, wound care supplies, antiseptic. I could not get a prescription without explaining why. But large animal veterinary antibiotics are available without prescription and pharmaceutically identical to human formulations. I drove to Spokane, 2 hours west, walked into a farm supply store on Division Street, and bought amoxicillin capsules in equine dosage, iodine solution, sterile gauze, surgical tape, and triple antibiotic ointment. The clerk was a kid barely out of high school who asked no questions. I paid $47.63 in cash. I told my mother I was going fishing, packed the medical supplies with food and a sleeping bag, and 2 days after finding Lisa, I was hiking back up the creek drainage with 35 pounds on my back. I reached the basin in late afternoon. Lisa was tending the fire. Samuel was in the same position, but worse. His breathing had a rattling quality that made my stomach clench, and his eyes were open, tracking my approach with an alertness that was unnerving in its intelligence. Those eyes assessed me the way a person assesses an uninvited guest, calculating threat and potential benefit simultaneously. Lisa spoke to him in a continuous murmur that blended English and the vocalizations she had learned. I could not follow the words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was telling him I was safe, that I had brought medicine. Samuel's eyes moved from me to Lisa and back. Then he made a sound I had never heard and will never forget, a low, sustained note from deep in his chest that resonated in the rock walls and vibrated in the ground beneath my feet. Lisa's eyes widened. "He is giving permission," she said. "Paul, in 15 years he has never done that with anyone but me." I approached. Each step felt like walking through something thicker than air. The proximity of him was overpowering. The heat, the musk, the sheer biological mass of a creature that made the air around it feel denser. I knelt beside Lisa and opened my pack with trembling hands. Lisa calculated the dosage based on Samuel's estimated weight, 500 to 550 pounds, and broke the horse-sized capsules open, mixing the powder into a paste with honey and mashed berries. She cleaned the wound with iodine, while Samuel flinched and growled but held still. His eyes locked on Lisa's face, as if her expression were the only thing preventing him from swatting me across the basin like a fly. She packed the wound with antibiotic ointment and bandaged it with gauze, working with speed and precision that would have impressed any trauma nurse. I stayed 4 days. By the second day, the swelling was visibly decreasing. By the third, Samuel was eating. By the fourth morning, he stood. He rose from the ground with a grunt that shook cedar needles loose from the branches above, and he stood there, favoring the injured leg but standing, and Lisa made a sound that was equal parts laugh and sob. He looked down at her, this creature that towered over both of us like a monument to a version of the world that existed before we simplified it, and he reached out one enormous hand and placed it on top of her head. The gesture was so gentle, so precisely calibrated between strength and tenderness, that I had to turn away because I was weeping and I did not want either of them to see. I left that afternoon. Lisa walked with me to the ridge above the basin. Below us, Samuel was sitting by the fire eating fish she had prepared. "Will you tell anyone?" she asked. "No." "Will you check on my mother? Tell her something that gives her comfort?" "Yes." "Will you come back?" I looked at her. 15 years had stripped away everything that was not essential and left behind something luminous. She was not the woman I had known. She was something the woman I had known had always been trying to become. "Every summer," I said. She hugged me. She smelled like wood smoke and cedar sap and wild animal and earth, and her arms were strong around my shoulders, and when she pulled back she was smiling, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen since 1988. I kept my promise. Every summer for the next 8 years, until 2011, I made the trip. I brought antibiotics, vitamins, a replacement knife, fishing line, a hand-crank flashlight, waterproof matches, and a medical reference book Lisa memorized within a month. I brought news of the world she absorbed with detached interest. She asked about her mother, always. She asked about the school sometimes. She never asked about anything else. I visited Lisa's mother many times. I told Carol a careful version of the truth, that a backcountry guide I knew had encountered a woman matching Lisa's description living purposefully in a remote area, that she was healthy and could not be contacted, but was alive and doing important work. Carol listened with an expression balancing hope against a lifetime of hard facts. She never asked me to take her to Lisa. I think she understood, at some level, that the Lisa alive in those mountains was not the Lisa who could come home. Carol Moore died in March of 2006, in her sleep at 78, with a photograph of Lisa on the bedside table and a hawk feather in her hand. I told Lisa about her mother's death on my summer visit. She walked to the edge of the basin and stood with her back to me for a long time, and then she made a sound that was not a word and not a cry and not anything I had a category for. It was one of Samuel's vocalizations, the one that meant missing someone who is gone, and she produced it from her own throat with a fidelity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Samuel, who was sitting by the creek, lifted his head and answered with the same sound, and for a moment the basin filled with a shared mourning that had nothing to do with species or language or any of the categories we use to sort the living from each other. A grief so pure it was simply frequency, vibrating in the rock and the water and the air. My last visit was August of 2011. I was 67, retired, and my knees were making it clear that the hike into the basin would be impossible within a year. Lisa was 54, but looked 10 years older, deeply weathered, though her eyes still burned with that focused intelligence. Samuel moved more slowly. His fur was heavily silvered, and he spent long hours sitting by the creek, staring at the water with an expression that suggested he was looking at something beneath the surface that only he could see. "He is old, Paul," Lisa said. "I don't know how old. There is no reference for this, but he is slowing, and I need to be here." On my last morning, Samuel did something unprecedented. He walked to where I was sitting, lowered himself to the ground beside me with a carefulness that spoke of stiff joints and fatigue, and placed his hand on my shoulder. His hand covered my entire shoulder and half my upper arm. The weight was extraordinary, but the pressure was calibrated with a delicacy that astonishes me to this day. He held it there for 30 seconds, looking at me with those amber eyes, and then he removed it and walked to the creek. Lisa was crying. "He has never done that with anyone but me," she said. "He is saying goodbye. He knows you are not coming back." I hiked out of the basin for the last time that afternoon. I did not look back. Looking back would have broken something in me that I needed to stay intact in order to carry the secret for however many years I had left. It has been 15 years since that last visit. I am 82. The trail to the basin might as well be on the moon. I have honored my promise. I have told no one until tonight. I have carried Lisa's story in a room in my mind that I visit in the small hours when the house is quiet and the world outside my window seems too tame and too small to contain the truth of what I know. But old men have a responsibility to the truth that supersedes their promises to the living. I do not know if Lisa is still alive. I do not know if Samuel is still alive. The coded mark we agreed upon, a series of notches on a specific tree at the trailhead that Lisa would carve if she needed help, has never appeared. The forest keeps its own counsel. The creatures within it answer to laws that were ancient before our species learned to walk upright. What I know is this. A fourth-grade teacher from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, walked into the St. Joe National Forest in the spring of 1988 and found something that most of us spend our entire lives looking for without knowing its name. She found a purpose that was bigger than her comfort, bigger than her career, bigger than the grief she caused the people who loved her. She found a creature that was alone in the world in a way that no human being has ever been alone. The last of something ancient and intelligent and irreplaceable, and she chose to stay with it. She chose to nurse its wounds, share its shelter, learn its language, and bear witness to its existence in a world that does not believe it is real. She gave up electricity, medicine, human conversation, the sound of her own name spoken by someone who knew her. She gave up birthdays and holidays and hot showers and coffee and clean sheets. And in return, she received something I have spent 22 years trying to name. She received the privilege of being trusted by something that had no reason to trust. She received the opportunity to ease the suffering of a being that had no one else. She received a life measured not by achievement or accumulation, but by the ancient, irreducible act of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. I drove to the St. Joe trailhead one last time in the fall of 2023. I could not make the hike. I sat in my truck and looked at the mountains, the same mountains that had swallowed Lisa Moore 35 years earlier, and the cedars were still standing, and the creek was still running, and the trail still disappeared into the shadows the way it always had, an invitation and a warning and a door that opened in one direction only. If you are listening to this, and you know those mountains, I am asking you one thing: leave them alone. Do not go looking for Lisa or Samuel or proof. The proof is in the tracks by the creek and the calls in the night and the 35 years of silence a woman maintained because she understood something the rest of us are still trying to learn. Some things are more important than being believed. Some secrets are not secrets at all, but acts of love so large they can only be carried in silence, passed from one keeper to the next, like a flame that must not go out. My name is Paul Wright. I was an assistant principal, and then a principal, and then a retiree, who drove a desk and mowed his lawn, and watched the evening news, and appeared, to anyone who looked, like an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But I have carried a story for 35 years that is too big for one person and too fragile for the world, and I am setting it down now, here, tonight, and walking away, and the mountains can have the rest.